So welcome to four-year transfers with Chelsea Hooks, and I'm Susan Peel. So we will go ahead and get started with this, the first slide, and I'm going to introduce Chelsea Hooks and have her take over.
Thanks, Susan. Again, good afternoon, everyone. So as far as the roadmap for today, I plan on discussing Proposal 2020-6, so the notification of transfer proposal and its impact on the recruiting eligibility and the financial aid legislation. I will then turn it over to Susan Peel, who's going to walk you all through some best practices and policies surrounding the transfer portal and the legislation, and then she'll finish off our presentation with the use of the transfer portal from start to finish. So let's go ahead and get started. So with the adoption of proposal number 2020-6, the permission to contact legislation will be replaced with the notification of transfer-based model. The new legislation will impact three buckets of the Division II legislation. Those three buckets are the recruiting, eligibility, and the financial aid legislation. One thing I do want to emphasize or note for you all is that the notification of transfer legislation won't go into effect until August 1 of this year. So currently, the permission to contact legislation is still in effect. So with the recruiting legislation, let's start with the first bucket. So currently under the permission to contact legislation, a Division II institution may not make contact with a student athlete at another NCAA institution without first obtaining permission to contact from that institution. If the original institution grants the request, then the second institution may contact the student athlete. However, if the original institution denies that request, a few things will occur there, which includes that the second institution may not contact that student athlete, nor may they encourage the transfer. So with the transition to the notification of transfer-based model, once a student athlete provides your institution with their written notification of transfer, your institution must place that student athlete within the transfer portal within 7 consecutive calendar days from receiving their written notification. Please note that once you place the student athlete in the portal, that student athlete's information becomes visible to all institutions. Further, unlike the permission to contact legislation, your institution may no longer block communication between the student athlete and another institution. So if once your student athlete asks you to place them in the transfer portal, it's available to all of the institutions, and you can no longer kind of silo who may contact that student athlete. So that's the recruiting piece. From an eligibility standpoint, I think us as staff were seeing some concerns regarding the notification of transfer legislation regarding the eligibility legislation. So under the eligibility portion of the legislation, I do want to reiterate that nothing really there. So if a student athlete transfers to another institution, the student athlete will still need to fulfill an academic year in residence, or will need to meet a transfer exception. So the one-time transfer exception or the discontinued non-sponsored sport exception, or will need to receive an approved legislative relief waiver in order to be immediately eligible upon transfer. Please note your institution still reserves the autonomy to either approve or deny the use of the one-time transfer exception. So for example, those of you who joined us for the PTD session on Monday, we're going to use Suzy Soccer. So if Suzy Soccer requests you as a compliance administrator or coach or whomever you all designate to place her into the transfer portal, your institutions may contact her. However, your institution still reserves the right to either deny the use of the one-time transfer exception. So unless Suzy Soccer meets another exception, or receives an approved blanket waiver from staff or the Committee for Legislative Relief, she will need to sit for 1 academic year in residence before immediately being eligible. So you all, as institutions, do still reserve the right to approve or deny the use of the one-time transfer exception. So nothing changes there once we transition over to the notification of transfer-based legislation. So the last bucket is the financial aid legislation. Under current legislation, if a student athlete requests permission to contact, that in and of itself would not constitute voluntary withdrawal. The same would apply with the notification of transfer legislation. Nothing changes there. If a student athlete requests to be placed in the transfer portal, that request or placing them in the portal in and of itself would not constitute them voluntarily withdrawing from the institution. Therefore, your institution would not be able to cancel the student athlete's aid during the period of that award. So going back to Susie Soccer, if she asked to be placed in the transfer portal during the fall term, so after the soccer season, championship segment, the institution would not be able to cancel her aid agreement since, 1, her request does not constitute voluntary withdrawal, and 2, because it's impermissible for an institution to cancel a student athlete's aid during the period of the award. So in this scenario, unless Susie triggers one of the prongs under our legislation that permits your institution to reduce or cancel her aid, so she either renders herself ineligible, right, or she fraudulently misrepresents any information on her application, letter of intent, or financial aid agreement, she engages in serious misconduct, or she truly voluntarily withdraws from your institution, the institution will not be able to cancel her athletics aid, but you all will be able to provide her with a non-renewal letter for the next academic year. Finally, under the permission to contact legislation, if your institution denies the request and the student athlete still transfer, the institution where the student athlete subsequently transfers to may not provide the student athlete with any aid during their first academic year. Under the notification of transfer-based model, the student athlete may now receive the athletics aid at the subsequent institution. So that opens up the student athlete from a financial aid standpoint where they are now able to receive aid at the next institution.
All right, well, thank you, Chelsea. If we can go and move on, we do have a short video that is going to start, and unfortunately, the sound is not working for us currently. So I will kind of tell you what is happening in this video. It's something that all of you have probably experienced, where you have a student athlete who walks into your office and you know, talks to you about the potential transfer. In this case, this student athlete's just not happy at his current institution, so he's asking about transferring and asking how to enter the transfer portal. So now that, you know, Chelsea walked you through the notification of transfer, we're going to put this feature film in motion and talk about, you know, what happens next on campus when using the transfer portal. So we go to the next slide. You know, many of you have been using the transfer portal over the last year with permission to contact. But for some of you on today's webinar, this may be all new to you. There's plenty of resources about the transfer portal located on the transfer portal resource page. So I'm not going to spend time today just going through each step of the portal. But what I wanted to do is just have a conversation and talking about the key components with the portal, because even when we move to the transfer portal, those main elements of the transfer process did not change. And so those are on the screen that I would consider kind of the 4 areas that we see. So those 4 areas are coach discussion, student athlete education, athletic aid, and transfer exceptions. So starting out, you know, I'm going to pose some questions for you all. If we were sitting in a room in person, we would be having some great dialogue about this. But what I want to do for today's purposes is pose these questions and let you really think about it. I'm going to offer you some advice for each one. But what I want you to do is, go back, talk to your compliance colleagues at other institutions within your conference and maybe within your next, conference call that you might have with your conference compliance administrators. Really talk about these, because this is where you're going to help each other in forming best practices that you can establish on your campus. So looking at that first question, the coach discussion. So what if the student athlete asks the compliance administrator to enter the transfer portal and the student athlete has not, and that's going to happen. And so that's where you need to come up with what's your method on campus to deal with this. Certainly you do not want to take the coach by surprise and have the coach find this out by another coach, calling that coach, inquiring what's going on with this student athlete. So if you have that scenario play out like it played out in the video, really think about the process that you want to have. Certainly, if your student athlete walks into your office and wants to start talking about transfer, probably your first question is going to be, have you talked to your coach about this? And encourage that dialogue. Now, there might be some reason why that communication is not occurring. And so obviously as an administrator and with your athletic director, you can get to, what those issues might be. Like any NCAA rules, you have the legislation, and then it's really up to you to form, what's your policy, what's your best practice. And so that would be the first one, is the communication that's going to occur between the student athlete, the coach, you as the compliance administrator, and possibly other administrators that need to be brought into the conversation. All right, the next one is student athlete education. So the question here, what educational opportunities are available to the student athlete before the student athlete is entered into the transfer portal? So you really do want to be proactive. The student athletes need to know what he or she is getting into if potentially looking at transferring. So making sure that you have education available for that student athlete on the front end. Student athletes do not have access to the portal, so they do not see any of the portal information. But you really do need to think about what type of education do we want to provide to our student athletes, so they really understand, for example, what Chelsea talked about with what this notification of transfer means. And then getting into the third is, what does it mean for their athletic aid? And so, certainly one of their questions is going to be, about their athletic aid, if it'll be canceled. And so, that first question, when can the athletic aid be canceled? And Chelsea walked through that part of the notification of transfer that does not allow, the aid to be canceled in that next term. However, you do still have that renewal cancellation reduction process that has that July 1st date that still does exist. And so what you want to do is make sure, again, that your student athletes understand about their athletic aid, which leads into the second question: what happens to the athletic aid if the student athlete does not continue attending team required activities? And Chelsea talked about, whether it's voluntary withdrawal from the team or not. And so that's where, again, clear established language in your athletic aid as far as, what does that actually mean if that student athlete is in non-compliance with not showing up for team workouts and other activities that you have established, and whether you can, cancel that athletics aid or not. But just know that, entering, again, the transfer portal does not equate to the student athlete volunteering from the team, and just making sure, I think a lot of you probably have a voluntary withdrawal notification that the student athlete has to sign off on, if that is in fact the intent of the student athlete to quit or voluntary withdrawal from the team. The next to think about are your transfer exceptions. because notification of transfer does not mean that that student athlete is immediately eligible. Again, these are two parts. Notification of transfer, entry into the transfer portal, it's just starting that communication and allowing that student athlete to start communicating about the transfer process with other coaches. Then, as an institution, you have the right to deny or grant the one-time transfer exception, which is going to lead to whether that student athlete is going to be immediately eligible or not. So that has not changed. And so what you want to do again is think about what are your best practices around communicating this to the student athlete about the difference between notification of transfer and the one-time transfer exception, and if that student athlete is going to be granted that or not. So this rule, obviously, like I said, is still the same for all your sports on your campus. And there is, I will note here, a new enhancement as of May 27th, if you have not discovered that yet and have seen those announcements in the transfer portal, that when you go into the one-time transfer exception, many of you ask for this to be more customized. And it's not just, yes or no, but you can customize it to say whether you are or not granting, to a specific division, because there's some institutions that will say, we're fine with our student athlete transferring to Division III, but we don't want the student to transfer to Division I or Division II. You can now note that by a drop-down box of selecting the division. You can select specific institutions, and you can select specific conferences. So keep in mind, too, because I've had this happen this week, that if you are being very specific to your conference, for example, that you are not granting the one-time transfer exception to your conference, you do not select then the division, because the division is only if you are just blanket that division, that student cannot be granted. So you only have to fill out one of those, whether it's the division, institution, or conference. All right, going on to the next one. All right, so now that we've gone through that, now is the time that the student athlete is then entered in the transfer portal. So some key reminders in these kind of 4 parts that I've laid out. What you'll notice here is, again, we have the change from permission to contact to notification of transfer. And then we're going to get into compliance inquiries, transfer tracer, and student athlete status. So starting out with that notification of transfer. Now we're looking at just kind of mechanical in the transfer portal. Again, I think that is pretty seamless. The only thing you're going to notice from what you currently see in the transfer portal, because you see permission to contact, on August 1st, that is going to change to notification of transfer. Also on August 1st, the restrictions questions that were part of the permission to contact, that now will not be included in your notification of transfer. So the process, again, it's still the same of entering the student athlete. That's the only thing you're going to notice that's different on the notification of transfer. Compliance inquiries, the next one. With the transfer portal, that does not take away any of your communication that you can have with other institutions, whether it's you inquiring about another student athlete to determine their eligibility, or it's one of your student athletes looking to transfer and another institution's inquiring about that student athlete's eligibility. So I just say that because that's really expected through this process, that you are still communicating as compliance offices from one institution to the other. To help you out with that, within the transfer portal, there is the institutional contact button. When you click that button, that will give you the phone number and email address for the senior compliance administrator on that campus. And you can even click email, and the email will actually even populate for you with the subject line already filled out with the student athlete's NCAA ID, student's name, and sport. And then you can inquire that way if you want to do that by email. Next would be the transfer tracer. The transfer tracer really is your way to include academic and athletic history of the student athletes in order to certify student athletes' eligibility. Now, again, when we moved from the way that you did this by paper form, hard copy, to an online process, again, really nothing changed other than moving to an online process. And we've tried to, with consultation by a lot in the membership, especially our Transfer Portal Advisory Group, to include all of the necessary information that you previously had on the Transfer Tracer. Now, certainly, if there's institutional policies that are very specific to your institution, that's not included, but hopefully you will find that you can place additional information in the additional comments. Now, a new enhancement in the Transfer Tracer that, again, went out on May 27th. There are 2 specific questions that are included now because we've gone through COVID and there has been, legislation to extend the academic year for, specific student athletes or that season not count, for example, those spring sports student athletes. So that information is now included. The other nice enhancement that's also included as of that May 27th date is a button that you can click. When you click the institutional contact, it says complete tracer. And when you click that, then that will notify that other institution that you want to get in touch with to actually complete that tracer so that you can view that information. And that email is already populated for you with all the content you need. If you need to customize it, you certainly can, but we tried to make it as easy as possible so you could just click that email. And so the biggest thing now is we're really looking at trying to make sure that the Transfer Tracer part of the portal really does simulate a lot of what you did before. So again, you go through the notification of transfer, that's step 1. Step 2 is the Transfer Tracer. These do not have to occur all at the same time. You can do this the same way that you've always done it before, where you just wait, possibly, until you get an inquiry about that student athlete. And what normally used to happen is they sent you a Transfer Tracer. Now maybe they will click the button and say, complete Transfer Tracer, and now you complete that. All right, the next is the student athlete status. And what exactly does that mean? Because you will see when you're viewing student athletes, or if it's your own student athlete, the status of active, withdrawn, or matriculate. So let's look at the next slide, and this is a helpful resource for you that's located on the Division II resource page. And I'm going to zero in on, if you go to the next slide, did the student athlete decide to transfer, and look at the status and talk about really whose responsibility is what, because I think there's been confusion on that part. And so withdrawn. The withdrawn is the responsibility of the current institution. So if you've entered a student athlete and now that student athlete decides, I don't want to continue exploring transfer, then you would withdraw that student athlete. And so now that student athlete status would show for all other institutions withdrawn and what that date and time where that occurred, so that anyone would know that student athlete could have been contacted at the point that the student athlete was initiated in the transfer portal or entered in the transfer portal to that point of withdrawn. So that would be your responsibility if it's your student athlete who comes back to you and says, hey, I don't want to continue on with this transfer. It's also your responsibility if, that you get into the next academic year and, that student athlete has, maybe come back to campus and ask now to be withdrawn, as a student athlete in the transfer portal. So it might not occur within that same academic year. The next one is the receiving institution's responsibility to then matriculate the student athlete. So if that student athlete does make that transfer, then that is that institution's responsibility. A new enhancement that again happened as of May 27th was to add in the matriculation process a question as far as what term is the student athlete matriculating, and you do now have the option to select summer if that student athlete has transferred for the summer, triggering that transfer status. So that is a slight change. I think that will help in getting everyone to matriculate those student athletes in a timely manner. And the last is the active status. So this is the student athlete who did not transfer to another NCAA institution because no one matriculated that record, or that student athlete has stayed at the current institution. And so that student athlete would remain active in that. And so any coaches then can still contact that student athlete, even though you might be in another year. So for anyone in those cases, you as an institution do not need to do anything with those active, again, unless this student fits the category of withdrawn or matriculated. All right, so I'll move on, and just before we open up the questions then, as far as there will be another set of enhancements. There will be a new version coming out, 3.0, on August 1st. As I mentioned, a few items, because we need to change this to notification of transfer for Division II, but we have a whole host of enhancements that will go in effect with that 3.0 version. The only reason that we released a kind of interim version on May 27th was, again, we wanted to get those COVID questions in there, and we took advantage of some time to put some of the enhancements that we already had done. We felt comfortable with those in this current version and went ahead and deployed that for you all. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Yeah, I just want to go to a question we received regarding your section, Susan, on best practices for educating student athletes on the notification of transfer legislation. So please note that the National SAC has developed a resource document regarding the notification of transfer legislation. So it's similar to the graphic that Division I put out when they adopted this legislation. So that document will be released this summer, so stay tuned there. Hopefully that document will help and assist you all in educating your student athletes on this process and the legislation. Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Chelsea. And I am looking at a few questions that I'm going to read off, and so I will try to read these because I'm seeing them for the first time here and answer them on the fly. Do coaches see the same info in the portal that compliance does? And the answer is no, because coaches do not have edit access. And so what coaches would see, what they currently see is permission to contact. When you switch to notification of transfer, they will see the notification transfer. So everything on that screen for notification transfer, that's what the coaches see. They also, see the status that I talked about, the withdrawn, the matriculated, and active. But where you can click on that status and see both the notification of transfer in the transfer tracer, the coaches cannot see that transfer tracer. And so again, as a best practice, if you want your coaches to see anything from the tracer, you can easily, there is a button where you can save that as a PDF, and then you could email that to your coaches. This next, if you completed a student athlete's file before May 27th, you have to go back in and complete the additional fields. Again, that's up to you to what you want to complete. Again, the transfer tracer is the athletic and academic history of the student athlete. And if you need to include the information that another institution needs in order to certify that student athlete, then yes, definitely go back in the file and complete that information. The next one, expectation or lack of to put in non-student athletes in the portal when they want to transfer or participate at a new school. Again, the expectation is left up to you all. We have in the transfer portal a no sport category for those non-student athletes, and the reason why is because when in development, we tried to make sure that it replicated what you were currently doing, and many institutions would send a notice to another institution asking for verification if the student athlete, or if this is a student or a student athlete, and that's what that serves as. So if you have a student and not a student athlete, you certainly could enter that student and then put no sport, and then obviously you wouldn't have to really fill out any of the tracer information again, unless any institution would ask for that. Do we withdraw them from the portal after one semester or after the year ends? Again, let's talk about withdrawal, make sure everybody understands what withdrawal means. Withdrawal means that the student athlete has asked to be withdrawn from the transfer portal. And so the timing of that's going to be whenever, that student athlete would ask to be withdrawn. And if that student athlete's in the portal as active and returns to your campus as a student athlete, and we're now into a next academic year, and that student still wants to be a student athlete, that's technically a withdrawal now. So then you would clean it up and withdraw those students at that time. What about student athletes who transfer to a non-NCAA institution? Do we pull from the portal? If the student athlete is at, let's say, a two-year college or NAIA, again, there's nothing to note there. We are looking at a possibility of a feature where you could, if you have knowledge of that, you could enter that. But I'm not sure yet if that's going to be one of the enhancements. But again, if they're not at an NCAA member institution, then they're not in the portal. The next one, what if the student athlete stays at the institution as a non-student athlete? What's the status in the portal? Good question. So if they stay at the institution as a non-student athlete, they're still active in the portal. You wouldn't withdraw them because they didn't return as a student athlete. So if they're just on campus, they might be still wanting to explore transfer opportunities. So you do nothing. You just keep that record as active. What should we do if the tracer is listed as complete, but not all questions are answered? Again, what would you do if you received an incomplete tracer by mail, hard copy? You certainly would reach out to the compliance administrator and ask for those questions to be completed, because you need those to certify the eligibility of the student athlete. So it would be no different. You would reach out, and again, there's a way to do that by just clicking in the transfer portal and sending an email to that compliance administrator and now asking them to complete that process. Since they may have already clicked the complete status, it's a very simple sending an email to the transfer@ncaa.org to unlock that record so that those questions and answers, or those answers to those questions, could be updated. And the last one I'm seeing here, can you put a student athlete in without an NCAA ID, such as the non-student athlete? And the answer is no. You have to have a student athlete ID. Student athletes can get that by registering with the Eligibility Center, or non-student athletes, I should say, because your student athlete's going to have that ID. Your non-student athletes can get that by registering with the eligibility with a profile account versus a certification account. The profile account does not cost any money, and it does give them an NCAA ID, and so you could enter that student athlete in, or that student, again, sorry for correcting, saying student athlete. So the student could be entered then with that NCAA ID through that profile account. Let me read, what if the student athlete's on scholarship but not part of the team? Are they still active in the portal? I guess I'm going to try to understand what the question is being asked, because if they're on scholarship, not part of the team, you would still need to put them in the portal, because they were a student athlete by definition of the legislation. So yes, you would still place that student athlete in the transfer portal. And the next one, is it very common for a tracer to be complete with errors? Could we add a feature to flag an account to reopen it instead of having us track down everyone via email? Yeah, I mean, you can do that right now. I mean, that's certainly all you have to do is contact me by email, call me, or again, if you just want to hit that transfer@nca.org, and certainly I can help out with, you know, talking to the other institution to double check, you know, what's going on with the error. Or again, you could contact that compliance administrator and say that I think there's information in the transfer tracer that might not be correct. All right, perfect. So thank you all for participating in today's webinar. Again, if, as you know, Chelsea mentioned, follow-up questions, definitely you can send those, again, through RISRO or transfer@nca.org, specific to the transfer portal, like the ones that I just read off. So hopefully everyone has a great rest of the day and continue being safe, and look forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you.